You ever wonder what it costs to bury a man who never wanted you? Not money. Money's easy. It's the weight of standing over a coffin, knowing the bastard inside spent 30 years pretending you didn't exist. That's the real price. And Adrian Vale was about to pay it in full. Stay with me through this. Trust me. What happens next changes everything. But, The carriage wheels ground against frozen gravel as Adrian Vale returned to Blackthorn Manor for the first time in a decade. December fog clung to the estate like guilt, thick and choking, turning the Gothic towers into shadows that watched without eyes. The place looked smaller than he remembered, meaner. Or maybe he'd just grown up enough to see it for what it always was, a monument to a man who valued stone over blood. Adrian stepped down onto the courtyard, boots crunching ice, and immediately wanted to leave. The air tasted like his childhood, cold, bitter, laced with expectation he could never meet. Servants he didn't recognize moved past him carrying black drapes and funeral wreaths, their faces carefully blank. Nobody acknowledged him. Nobody had to. The message was clear. He was late, unwanted, and only here because death demanded witnesses. A hunched figure emerged from the main entrance. Gerald, the estate steward. Ancient now, spine curved like a question mark, but his eyes still sharp as audit ledgers. "Your father's in the chapel," he said flatly. "You're expected at the viewing within the hour." Adrian didn't answer. What was there to say? "Thanks for the warm welcome home." Gerald studied him with something between pity and contempt. "The will reading follows the burial tomorrow. I suggest you prepare yourself." "For what?" "For disappointment," Gerald said, turning back toward the manor. "You've had plenty of practice." But the chapel smelled like lilies and lies. Adrian stood alone before the open coffin, staring down at Duke Cedric Blackthorn's corpse. Even dead, the old man looked imperious, jaw set, hands folded across his chest, dressed in military regalia he hadn't earned in any war Adrian knew about. Someone had closed his eyes, but Adrian could still feel them judging him from beyond whatever hell aristocrats descended to. He should have felt something: grief, relief, anger, anything. Instead, there was just emptiness, the kind that comes from mourning a father who died long before his heart stopped. Cedric had been 58. Heart failure, they said. Quick, clean, convenient. "You never even tried," Adrian whispered to the corpse. "Not once." A floorboard creaked behind him. He turned to find a woman in mourning black standing in the chapel doorway. Mid-30s, sharp cheekbones, eyes like flint. She moved with the precision of someone who'd spent years navigating hostile territory. "Lady Miriam Hallow," she introduced herself. "Your father's associate. I handled certain affairs for him." Adrian's laugh was hollow. "Affairs? That's a polite word for whatever he was into." She didn't smile. "You don't know what he was into. That's why I'm here." She crossed to the coffin, reached inside, and before Adrian could process what was happening, she lifted Cedric's left hand. With practiced efficiency, she twisted a signet ring, pressed something beneath it, and a hidden compartment in the coffin's silk lining clicked open. Adrian's breath stopped. Inside lay an iron key, old, intricate, marked with symbols he didn't recognize, and a rolled map sealed with black wax. "What the hell is this?" Miriam's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Your inheritance, the real one. Not the title, not this rotting estate. Something your father spent 30 years protecting." She pressed the key into his palm. It was cold, heavy, humming with unspoken weight. "Vesper Isle," she said. "Ever heard of it?" "No." "Good. Neither has anyone else. Not officially." Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "Your father ruled it. In secret. For decades. And now someone's trying to find it." Adrian stared at her like she'd started speaking backwards. "Ruled what? A secret kingdom? That's insane." Miriam's expression didn't change. "Check the map. You'll see coordinates. A route beyond the northern sea. No nation claims those waters. No chart marks that island. But it's real. And it's worth killing for." She stepped back toward the shadows of the chapel. "Your father left you more than a coffin and a cold house, Mr. Vale. He left you a war you don't even know you're in. People are coming, powerful people. And they think you know where it is." "Who?" She paused at the doorway. Lords with older money than yours. Men who don't like leaving treasures unclaimed. They'll smile at the funeral. They'll offer condolences. And then they'll tear this estate apart looking for what your father hid. Why are you telling me this? Because he asked me to. If something happened to him. Miriam's voice softened, just barely. He knew he was running out of time. Adrian looked down at the key, then back up, but she was already gone, swallowed by the dark corridor outside. He stood alone again with his father's body and a secret that weighed more than the coffin itself. The funeral was a performance. 200 mourners dressed in expensive grief, whispering about the great Duke Cedric Blackthorne, war hero, philanthropist, pillar of English nobility. Adrian recognized maybe 10 of them. The rest were vultures in tailcoats, scanning the estate with appraising eyes, calculating inheritances and political leverage. Adrian played his part, stood solemn by the grave, nodded at condolences that meant nothing, shook hands that felt like traps. Every lord who approached him smiled too wide. Every lady offered sympathy that came with questions attached. Lord Percival Ashford, a barrel-chested man with a silver beard, clasped Adrian's shoulder like they were old friends. Your father was a remarkable man, did business across half the world. I imagine his affairs were extensive. Adrian met his eyes. I wouldn't know. We weren't close. Ashford's smile tightened. Yes, I'd heard. Tragic, really. A son should know his father's work, especially when responsibilities pass down. What responsibilities? Ashford leaned in closer, breath smelling of tobacco. Certain ventures, overseas interests. Your father never mentioned holdings beyond England? Adrian's instinct screamed, No, nothing. Ashford's gaze lingered a beat too long. Well, if you discover anything unusual, you know where to find me. Old partners should stick together. He walked away, but Adrian felt the weight of his attention still crawling over him like spiders. The ceremony dragged on. Dirt hit the coffin in hollow thuds. A priest Adrian didn't recognize recited verses Cedric never believed. And through it all, Adrian's hand stayed in his coat pocket, gripping the iron key until his palm ached. That night, Adrian locked himself in his father's study. The room hadn't changed. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather chairs that smelled like cigars and old money, a mahogany desk covered in papers Gerald had neatly organized. Everything was precise, controlled, suffocating. Adrian lit the fireplace and spread the map across the desk. It was old, older than it should have been. The parchment was thick, edges worn soft by decades of handling. The ink showed England's northern coast, then open water stretching into regions marked only as unknown sea on standard maps. But Cedric's map showed something else, a route, coordinates. And at the end of the line, a small island labeled in faded script, Vesper Isle. Beneath the name, a single sentence in his father's handwriting, What I protected, what they must never find. Adrian stared at those words until his eyes burned. His father had spent 30 years vanishing for months at a time, offering no explanations, showing no affection, treating Adrian like an inconvenient detail in a life Adrian was never allowed to understand. And now this, a secret kingdom, hidden rulers, conspiracies. It made no sense. It made too much sense. A knock at the door shattered his focus. Adrian's hand moved instinctively to the letter opener on the desk. Come in. Gerald entered carrying a leather-bound ledger. He set it down with deliberate care. Your father's private accounts. He instructed these be given to you after his death. No one else has seen them. Adrian opened the ledger. Rows of transactions stretched back decades. Shipments, payments, names he didn't recognize, and amounts, staggering amounts, flowing in and out of accounts labeled only with codes. What was he paying for? Gerald's face was stone. I was told not to ask questions. Adrian flipped through pages, frustration building. He ruled an entire island, Gerald, in secret, and nobody noticed? Gerald's silence was answer enough. Adrian slammed the ledger shut. Did you know? All these years, did you know what he was doing? The old man's expression finally cracked. Just barely. I knew your father was a man who made difficult choices. I knew he carried burdens he couldn't share, and I knew he loved you more than he could ever show. Adrian's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. Love. Right. That's why he sent me away when I was 8. That's why he didn't attend my graduation. Didn't write. Didn't visit. He was protecting you. From what? Gerald met his eyes with something that looked like fear, from becoming collateral. He left without another word, and Adrian sat alone in the firelight, staring at maps and ledgers and the fragments of a life he never understood. Moment. 3 days after the burial, Adrian made his decision. He stood in the Blackthorn Library at dawn, packing a leather satchel with the map, the key, his father's private journal, and enough gold to get passage on a ship that didn't ask questions. Gerald watched from the doorway, disapproval radiating like heat. This is madness. Probably. You have no idea what you're walking into. Adrian slung the satchel over his shoulder. That's never stopped anyone before. Your father spent decades keeping that place hidden for a reason. Gerald's voice cracked. If you go there, you're exposing it, and everyone who depends on its secrecy. Adrian turned to face him. Then they should have told me, before he died, before someone started hunting for it. He paused. You knew, didn't you? About the island? Gerald didn't answer. Adrian nodded slowly. Yeah, that's what I thought. So don't lecture me about responsibility when everyone around him spent years lying. He walked past Gerald, down the grand staircase, through the entrance hall that had never felt like home. A carriage waited outside. No family to see him off, no servants waving goodbye. Just fog and frost and the weight of a secret he didn't ask for. Adrian Vale climbed into the carriage and gave the driver a single instruction. North, to the docks. As the Blackthorn estate disappeared into the mist behind him, Adrian felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. And beneath it, the creeping certainty that he was being followed. The port town of Grimsby smelled like fish guts and desperation. Adrian found passage on a cargo ship called the Wave Rider, captained by a one-eyed Scotsman named McLean, who asked exactly 0 questions when Adrian paid triple the standard fare. We leave at dawn, McLean grunted. Don't be late, and don't bring trouble. Adrian handed over the coordinates from his father's map. McLean studied them, eyebrows climbing. Nobody sails that far north this time of year. Ice flows, storms, ships that go out there don't always come back. I'll take my chances. McLean grunted again. Your funeral. Adrian spent the night in a dockside inn that rented rooms by the hour. He didn't sleep. Every footstep in the hallway made him reach for the knife he'd bought that afternoon. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like someone picking the lock. Around 3 a.m., his instincts proved right. The door handle turned, slowly, silently. Adrian was already pressed against the wall beside the door frame, knife in hand, heartbeat slamming against his ribs. The door eased open. A figure slipped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with professional precision. Adrian moved fast. He kicked the door shut, grabbed the intruder from behind, and pressed the blade against his throat. Who sent you? The man didn't struggle, didn't panic. His voice was calm, almost amused. Easy, Mr. Vale. I'm not here to kill you. Then what? The man raised his hand slowly. My name is Captain Thomas Wren, Royal Navy, retired. Your father hired me 5 years ago to keep watch on certain interests. Adrian didn't lower the knife. Prove it. Wren reached into his coat, slowly, and pulled out a sealed letter. Adrian snatched it, keeping the blade steady, and broke the wax. His father's handwriting stared back at him. If you're reading this, I'm dead. Trust Wren. He knows the waters, he knows the danger, and he'll get you there alive. Adrian lowered the knife, slowly. Wren turned, rubbing his throat. You've got your father's instincts. I've got his paranoia. Wren's smile was grim. Out where you're going, that's the same thing. He moved to the window, checked the street below. We need to leave now. Not at dawn. Now. Why? Because Lord Ashford's men just checked into the inn across the street, and they're asking about you. Adrian's blood went cold. How many? 4 that I counted. Maybe more outside. Wren met his eyes. They're not here to talk, Mr. Vale. They're here to find what your father hid, and they'll gut you to get it. Adrian grabbed his satchel. Back exit? Follow me. They moved through the inn's rear stairwell, down into a basement that reeked of mildew and rot. Wren kicked open a door leading into an alley. The street beyond was dark, empty, slick with freezing rain. Behind them, footsteps thundered through the inn. Shouts. Breaking wood. They ran. Adrian's lungs burned as they sprinted through Grimsby's maze of alleys, boots splashing through icy puddles, the docks growing closer with every gasping breath. Behind them, the pursuit continued, organized, relentless, closing in. Wren shoved Adrian toward the wave rider, already moving in the water, ropes being cast off. Jump! Adrian leaped, hit the deck hard, rolled to his feet. Wren landed beside him a second later. The ship lurched forward, sails catching wind, pulling away from the dock. On the pier, 4 men in dark coats appeared, weapons drawn. One raised a pistol. Wren tackled Adrian to the deck as the shot cracked through the air. The bullet splintered wood inches from Adrian's head. The wave rider surged into open water, the port shrinking behind them, swallowed by fog and distance. Adrian lay on the cold deck, heart hammering, adrenaline screaming through his veins. Wren pulled him upright. "Welcome to your inheritance, Mr. Vale. Hope it's worth dying for." Adrian looked back at the vanishing coastline of England, then forward into the black expanse of unknown sea ahead. No turning back now. And somewhere in the darkness of his father's past, a hidden kingdom waited, wrapped in fog, buried in secrets, and defended by people who had no idea their protector was dead. Adrian gripped the iron key in his pocket. "What the hell did you leave me, old man?" The North Sea didn't give a damn about inheritance or destiny. It was cold, brutal, and efficient at reminding men they were small. Adrian spent the first 3 days seasick, heaving over the rail while Wren watched with the detached amusement of someone who'd seen worse. "You'll adjust," Wren said on the 4th morning, handing him stale bread and water. "Or you won't. Either way, we're 2 weeks out." Adrian forced the bread down, jaw tight. His body was learning what his mind already knew. There was no comfort where he was going, no safety net, just forward momentum and the consequences that came with it. The wave rider cut through gray water under grayer skies. McLean's crew kept to themselves, speaking in low voices when they spoke at all. They knew the route was wrong, too far north, too deep into waters that swallowed ships without explanation. But gold bought silence, and desperation bought loyalty, so they sailed and didn't ask questions. Wren stood beside Adrian at the bow one evening, watching ice floes drift past like corpses. "Your father made this crossing 43 times, Wren said quietly. "First time, he was younger than you, thought he was hunting pirate routes for the crown, found something else entirely." "What did he find?" "People who'd been invisible for 200 years. Wren's expression went distant. "Refugees. Survivors of royal purges nobody recorded. They built Vesper from nothing, stone by stone. No treaties, no recognition, just existence maintained through absolute secrecy. And my father decided to rule them?" Wren shook his head. "They asked him to. Needed someone with connections to the mainland. Protection from afar. He gave them 30 years, shipments, trade routes nobody could trace, political cover when expeditions got too close." He paused. "Your father wasn't a good man, Adrian, but he was their man." Adrian's hands gripped the rail until his knuckles went white. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Because you would have become a target. Anyone who knew about Vesper became a liability. Easier to keep you ignorant and safe." "Safe," Adrian repeated bitterly. "Yeah, that worked out great." Wren studied him with something like sympathy. "You're alive. That's more than most heirs can say when kingdoms are at stake. Dak." On the 8th day, the fog came. It rolled across the water like something alive, thick, suffocating, turning the world into shades of gray that swallowed sound and distance. The crew grew tense. McLean ordered sails trimmed, speed reduced. They were entering the belt of permanent mist that surrounded Vesper Isle, the natural barrier that had kept it hidden for centuries. Wren stood at the helm beside McLean, calling out directions from memory. Adrian watched them work, feeling useless and increasingly certain this was a mistake. Every instinct screamed that sailing blind into uncharted waters, chasing a dead man's secret was insanity. But turning back meant facing Ashford's men, meant living with questions that would eat him alive. So he stood on deck and waited while the fog pressed in. The crew saw them first. "Ships," someone whispered, 3 points off starboard. Adrian squinted into the murk. Shapes emerged, dark silhouettes, sleek and fast, cutting through the fog with predatory efficiency. Not merchant vessels, not fishing boats, patrol ships. Wren's jaw tightened. They've seen us. The lead vessel altered course, closing distance. Adrian could make out details now. Black hulls, no flags, mounted cannons along the rails. Professional. Military. Wrong. Those aren't Vesper ships, Wren muttered. How do you know? Because Vesper doesn't patrol. They hide. His hand moved to the pistol at his belt. Someone else found the island first. McLean barked orders. The Wave Rider tried to come about, but the patrol ships were faster, surrounding them in a loose triangle. A voice boomed across the water, amplified through a speaking trumpet. Heave to and prepare for boarding, by order of the Admiralty Consortium. Adrian looked at Wren. What's the Admiralty Consortium? Wren's face went pale. Trouble. Big trouble. The patrol ships closed in. Grappling hooks flew, biting into the Wave Rider's rails. Armed men swarmed aboard, 20 of them, maybe more, dressed in dark uniforms without insignia. They moved with military precision, weapons drawn, securing the deck in under a minute. A tall man stepped across from the lead ship. 50s, graying beard, eyes like calculation incarnate. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd been obeyed for so long he'd forgotten what resistance looked like. Captain Edmund Harrow, he introduced himself, representing certain invested parties with claims to these waters. He scanned the Wave Rider's deck, gaze landing on Adrian. And you must be young Vale, the son. Adrian kept his expression flat. I don't know what you're talking about. Harrow smiled. Of course you don't. He gestured to his men. Search the ship. I want maps, documents, anything that indicates destination or intent. The crew was shoved aside as soldiers tore through the hold. Adrian's heart slammed against his ribs, but he forced himself still. The satchel with his father's journal was hidden in his cabin, sewn into the mattress lining. It would take time to find, time he needed to use. You have no authority here, Adrian said evenly. These are international waters. Harrow's laugh was dry as bone. International waters are a polite fiction maintained by people too weak to claim them. His expression hardened. Your father understood that. He built an empire on that understanding, and now that empire is being reallocated. To who? To those with the will to hold it. Harrow stepped closer. Vesper Isle has been hidden long enough. The resources there, silver, strategic position, deep water harbors, are too valuable to remain under the control of ghosts and forgotten refugees. Adrian's blood went cold. You know about the island. Everyone knows now, Mr. Vale. Your father's death changed everything. The seals have been broken, the routes exposed. Harrow's smile turned predatory. We're not here to stop you from reaching Vesper. We're here to make sure you lead us there. A soldier emerged from below deck, carrying Adrian's satchel. Found this, sir. Hidden compartment. Harrow took the satchel, opened it, pulled out Cedric's journal and the map. His eyes gleamed. Perfect. He looked at Adrian. You're going to cooperate, Mr. Vale. You're going to take us to Vesper, and in exchange, we won't sink this ship and leave you to freeze in the water. Adrian's jaw clenched. And if I refuse? Harrow nodded to one of his men, who grabbed McLean and pressed a pistol to the captain's head. Then your crew dies, one at a time, starting now. The hammer clicked back. Adrian raised his hands. Stop, I'll do it. Harrow smiled. Excellent choice. He gestured to his men. Take them aboard the lead ship. Keep them separated. If anyone tries anything, kill the captain first. They were dragged across the ships. Adrian shoved into a cramped cabin below deck. The door slammed shut, locked from outside. He was alone with the sound of his own breathing and the certainty that he'd just made the worst decision of his life. Hours passed. The ships moved through fog, engines thrumming. Adrian sat in darkness, mind racing. Harrow had the map, the journal, everything. But he still needed Adrian alive, which meant he didn't have all the pieces yet. The iron key was still hidden in Adrian's boot. Whatever it unlocked, Harrow didn't know about it. That was leverage. Small, maybe useless. But it was something. The door opened. Wren was shoved inside, bleeding from a split lip. You all right? Wren spat blood. Been worse. He lowered his voice. Listen carefully. Harrow's not acting alone. He's got backing from at least 3 major noble houses. This isn't a raid, it's an invasion. How many ships? Ren's expression was grim, enough to flatten Vesper's defenses in an afternoon. They've been planning this for months. Your father's death was the opening they needed. Adrian's hands curled into fists. So what do we do? Ren met his eyes. We warn them. If we can reach Vesper before Harrow's fleet commits, maybe the island can evacuate. Hide the population. Burn the harbors. Deny them anything worth taking. That'll destroy everything my father built. Ren's voice was hard. Your father built survival. That's all Vesper ever was. And survival means adapting. He paused. There's someone on the island you need to meet. Lady Seraphine Ashcombe. She commands the defense forces. If anyone can organize a resistance, it's her. Adrian nodded slowly. So we get to Vesper, find this Seraphine, and hope she doesn't kill us on sight for leading an invasion fleet to her doorstep. Ren's smile was bleak. That's the plan. Honk. 2 days later, land appeared. Adrian stood on the deck of Harrow's ship, wrists bound, watching cliffs emerge from the fog like teeth. Vesper Isle rose sheer from the water, jagged rock faces climbing hundreds of feet, crowned with dense forest and stone fortifications that looked older than England itself. No beaches, no obvious harbors, just cliffs and mist and the sense of something vast hidden behind natural walls. Harrow stood beside him, studying the island through a spyglass. Magnificent, he murmured. Your father chose well. The fleet slowed, circling the island's perimeter. Signal flags rose on the lead ship. A response came from the cliffs, warning shots from hidden cannons, splashing into the water 50 yards ahead. Harrow lowered the spyglass, unfazed. Tell them who you are, Mr. Vale. Tell them you've come home. Adrian's throat was dry. What makes you think they'll listen? Because you're Cedric Blackthorn's son. And on Vesper, that name still means something. Harrow gestured to a speaking trumpet. Use it. Unless you want this to start with cannon fire. Adrian took the trumpet, hands shaking. He raised it to his lips. His voice carried across the water, amplified and strange to his own ears. This is Adrian Vale, son of Duke Cedric Blackthorn. I'm here under the terms of my father's will. I seek entry to Vesper Isle. Silence. The fog swallowed his words. Then, from the cliffs, a response. A woman's voice, sharp and commanding. Adrian Vale died 10 years ago. Whoever you are, turn back. Adrian's heart lurched. It's me. I have proof. I carry the Blackthorn seal, and the Blackthorn seal has been carried by thieves before. The woman's voice was ice. You have 30 seconds to withdraw. After that, we open fire. Harrow grabbed Adrian's shoulder, voice low and dangerous. Make them believe you. Now. Adrian's mind raced. He thought of his father's journal, the map, everything he'd read during the voyage. A detail surfaced, something specific, something only family would know. He raised the trumpet again. When I was 8 years old, my father left me at Blackthorn for the winter. Before he sailed, he told me a story about a lighthouse, an old stone tower on an island where people went to forget. He said the light never went out because someone had to keep watch. He said it was my job now. His voice cracked. I didn't understand then. I do now. He was talking about Vesper, about duty, about carrying weight nobody else could see. Silence stretched. Adrian's pulse hammered in his ears. Then the cannons went quiet. A narrow passage opened in the cliff face, concealed behind rockfall and spray, invisible until it moved. A single ship emerged, smaller than Harrow's vessels, flying a flag Adrian had never seen, a black tower on a gray field. Seraphine Ashcombe stood at the bow, tall and sharp-edged as broken glass. She was younger than Adrian expected, early 30s, dark hair pulled back, dressed in practical leather and steel. Her eyes swept across the fleet, calculating odds and finding them wanting. You brought an army to my doorstep, she called across the water. Her voice was controlled fury. Explain, fast. Adrian opened his mouth, but Harrow spoke first. Lady Ashcombe, Captain Edmund Harrow. I represent the Admiralty Consortium. We're here to negotiate Vesper's transition into legitimate governance under Crown authority. Seraphine's expression didn't change. We have no crown. We have no governance but our own. Leave. Harrow's smile was patient. I'm afraid that's no longer an option. Vesper's secrecy died with Duke Blackthorn. The island is known. Its resources are documented. Continued isolation is untenable. Then we'll continue it anyway. Harrow sighed. Lady Ashcombe, be reasonable. You have, what, 3,000 people on that island? We have 20 ships and 600 trained soldiers. This isn't a negotiation you can win with cannons. Seraphine's hand moved to the sword at her hip. Then we won't negotiate. Adrian stepped forward, pulling against his bonds. Stop, both of you. His voice cut through the tension. Seraphine, I'm not here to invade. I'm here because my father left me no choice. Her eyes locked onto his. Your father spent 3 decades keeping us secret, and you led an invasion fleet straight to our harbor. I didn't lead them. They followed me. Adrian's voice rose. They have the map, the routes, the coordinates. If I'd stayed in England, they would have come anyway. At least this way you get warning. Seraphine studied him for a long moment. Then her gaze shifted to Harrow. You have 1 hour to withdraw beyond the fog belt. If you're still here after that, we start sinking ships. Harrow's expression hardened. You'll lose. Probably, Seraphine agreed. But we'll take enough of you down that the invasion becomes too expensive to finish. Is Vesper worth that cost, Captain? Bodies floating in the harbor? Burned ships? A victory that bleeds you dry? Harrow's jaw worked. You're bluffing. Try me. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Finally, Harrow nodded. 1 hour. But understand this, Lady Ashcombe, we're not leaving these waters. We'll negotiate terms. Peacefully, if possible. But one way or another, Vesper becomes part of the world today. He turned to his men. Release Vale. Let him go ashore. Adrian's bonds were cut. He stumbled forward, blood rushing back into his wrists. Seraphine's ship pulled alongside, and rough hands hauled him across the gap. He landed on the deck, legs unsteady, and looked up to find Seraphine standing over him. Her expression was carved from stone. If you're lying, she said quietly, I'll throw you off the cliffs myself. Adrian met her eyes. I'm not lying. Good. She turned to her crew. Take us in, and prepare the council. We're going to war. The ship slipped back through the hidden passage, cliffs closing behind them like jaws. And Adrian Vale crossed the threshold into the kingdom his father had ruled in silence, a kingdom that now balanced on the edge of annihilation, held together by secrets, silver, and the desperate hope that invisibility could last forever. It couldn't, and everyone on Vesper Isle was about to learn just how fragile safety had always been. The harbor was carved directly into the cliff face, a massive natural cavern expanded by centuries of human labor. Docks stretched into dark water lit by oil lamps, warehouses built into stone walls, ships of every size tied to moorings. The air smelled like salt, tar, and industry. This wasn't a forgotten island. This was a functioning kingdom hidden inside a mountain. Adrian barely had time to process it before Seraphine grabbed his arm and dragged him up a stone staircase that climbed the cliff's interior. They ascended in silence, boots echoing, until they emerged into daylight, or what passed for it through the perpetual fog. Vesper spread before him. It wasn't a village. It was a fortress city, stone buildings with thick walls and narrow windows, streets laid out in defensive patterns, watchtowers marking the perimeter, and beyond the settlement, forests climbed toward mountains that disappeared into low clouds. Everywhere, people moved with purpose, soldiers drilling, workers hauling supplies, families going about lives Adrian couldn't fathom. They'd built this, in secret, for 200 years. Seraphine led him into a squat stone building at the settlement's center. Inside, a circular chamber with a table surrounded by hard-faced men and women who stopped talking the moment Adrian entered. This is him? An older man demanded. Cedric's son? Seraphine nodded. And he brought the consortium's fleet to our doorstep. The room exploded into overlapping voices, accusations, questions, fury barely contained. Adrian stood frozen under their collective rage until Seraphine slammed her fist on the table. Enough. Silence. She turned to Adrian. Tell them everything, why you came, what they want, what they know. So Adrian told them. He told them about his father's death, the hidden map, the key, Lord Ashford's pursuit, Harrow's fleet, the noble houses backing the invasion. He laid out every detail he knew and admitted the gaps in his knowledge. By the end, his throat was raw and the room was silent. The older man who'd spoken first, Lord Marcus Thorne, Seraphine introduced him, leaned back in his chair. So Duke Cedric spent 30 years protecting us, and in death, he exposed us. His laugh was bitter. Fitting. It wasn't his fault, Adrian said. He tried. He failed, Marcus snapped. And now we pay the price. He looked at Seraphine. How long do we have? She checked the window. Harrow gave us an hour. Half that's already gone. Then we evacuate. Burn the harbors. Collapse the passage. Make Vesper worthless. Another council member, a woman with scars across her face, shook her head. And go where, Marcus? We've been invisible for 2 centuries because we had nowhere else to go. You think the mainland will welcome us now? So we fight, someone else argued. With what? 3 outdated cannons and a militia that's never seen real combat? The argument spiraled. Adrian watched their unity fracture in real time, fear and anger tearing at solutions that didn't exist. Seraphine's voice cut through the chaos. We have a third option. Everyone turned. We negotiate. She looked at Adrian. Your father ruled here because we needed protection from the outside world. Maybe his son can do the same. Adrian's stomach dropped. I'm not my father. No, you're better. She stepped closer. Cedric was brilliant, strategic, cold. You? You're desperate. And desperation is visible. The consortium will read you as weak. They'll underestimate you. Her eyes burned. Use that. How? Offer them a treaty. Seraphine's voice was hard. Vesper remains independent, but we open trade, controlled access, limited visitation. We give them enough to satisfy their investors without giving them control. Marcus scoffed. They'll never accept that. Then we sweeten the deal. Seraphine looked at Adrian. You're Duke Blackthorn now. You carry the title, the legitimacy. If you formally recognize Vesper as a sovereign territory under your protection, it becomes a political nightmare to invade. Noble houses can't just seize land claimed by another peer. That's insane, Adrian breathed. I have no power, no army. You have a name. And in their world, names are power. She leaned in. You wanted to know what your father left you? This. The burden of keeping these people alive by playing a game you don't understand. Adrian's hand shook. What if I fail? Then we all die. Seraphine's expression didn't waver. But at least you'll have tried, which is more than running gives us. The room held its breath. Adrian looked at their faces, scared, angry, desperate. People whose entire existence depended on the choices of a man they'd met 20 minutes ago. He thought of his father, the decades of secrecy, the double life, the weight carried in silence. And he realized this was the inheritance that actually mattered. Not titles, not estates. The choice to carry weight nobody else could see. Adrian straightened. Tell Harrow I want to negotiate. Alone. No weapons. On his ship. Seraphine studied him. That's suicide. Maybe. Adrian met her eyes. But it's the only move they won't expect. She nodded slowly. If you die, I'm destroying the fleet. If I die, Adrian said, make sure it costs them everything. 1 hour later, Adrian stood on the deck of Harrow's flagship, surrounded by armed soldiers, staring down a man who held all the cards. Harrow smiled. Mr. Vale, I'm surprised you came. Adrian kept his voice steady. I'm here to make a deal. I already have everything I need. The routes, the charts, the island's location. What could you possibly offer? Legitimacy. Harrow's smile faded. Adrian pressed forward. You can invade Vesper, burn it, occupy it, but you'll never hold it, because the moment you attack, I make the island's existence public. I go to Parliament, the press, every foreign embassy, and I tell them a consortium of noble houses just committed an act of war against a sovereign territory under Blackthorn protection. You have no proof of sovereignty. Adrian pulled the iron key from his boot. I have this. My father's seal, his journal, 30 years of documented governance. He stepped closer. You want Vesper's silver? Its harbors? Fine. But you get it through treaty, not invasion. Controlled trade. Limited access. You make profit. The consortium gets returns. and nobody has to explain corpses to the crown. Harrow's jaw tightened. And if we refuse, then you kill me. And Vesper becomes a graveyard nobody can monetize. Adrian's voice hardened. Ask yourself, Captain, do your investors want victory or profit? Because you can't have both. Silence stretched. Harrow's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Try me. The deck creaked. Soldiers shifted. For 10 long seconds, Adrian waited to die. Then Harrow laughed, short, sharp, surprised. You've got more of your father in you than I thought. He turned to his men. Lower weapons. He looked back at Adrian. You have 48 hours to draft terms. If I don't like them, we proceed with invasion. Understood? Understood. Harrow extended his hand. Welcome to politics, Mr. Vale. It's a knife fight in a locked room. Hope you're ready. Adrian shook his hand, feeling the trap close around both of them. I'm learning. What? When Adrian returned to Vesper, Seraphine was waiting on the dock. Did it work? Adrian's legs nearly gave out. For now. She studied his face. You look like you're going to be sick. I am. But later. Right now, we have 48 hours to turn this island into something they can't afford to destroy. He met her eyes. Can we do that? Seraphine's smile was sharp as broken glass. Watch me. And in the fog-shrouded kingdom nobody was supposed to know about, Duke Adrian Vale learned the hardest lesson of power. Survival wasn't about strength. It was about making the other side believe destroying you cost more than keeping you alive. The real war hadn't even started yet. 48 hours to save a kingdom nobody was supposed to know existed. Adrian spent the first 12 learning just how fragile Vesper's survival had always been. Seraphine led him through the fortress city at dawn, pointing out what his father had built and what he'd left vulnerable. The harbor cannons were outdated, their range barely reaching the fog belt. The militia numbered 300, mostly fishermen and miners who'd trained on weekends. The food stores could sustain the population for 6 months, maybe 8 if they rationed hard. Everything was designed for secrecy, not siege. Your father kept us hidden, Seraphine said as they climbed the watchtower overlooking the northern cliffs. But he never prepared us to be found. Adrian stared at the fleet waiting beyond the fog, 20 dark shapes that could reduce everything to rubble in an afternoon. Why didn't he? Because preparing for invasion meant admitting invasion was possible. Her voice was hard. Cedric ruled through denial. As long as Vesper stayed invisible, he could pretend we were safe. Adrian's jaw clenched. And now that illusion's dead. Now we adapt. She turned to face him. The treaty terms you promised Harrow, what exactly did you offer? Adrian pulled out the draft he'd worked on through the night. Limited trade rights, controlled merchant access twice a year, a percentage of silver exports in exchange for political protection, and recognition of Vesper as an autonomous territory under Blackthorn governance. Seraphine scanned this document. Her expression didn't change. This gives them everything. It gives them profit without occupation. Adrian's voice was rough from exhaustion. That's the best deal they'll get. And what do we get? She looked up. The privilege of being exploited legally instead of conquered? We get to survive. Seraphine handed the document back. Survival isn't the same as living, Adrian, but I suppose your father never taught you the difference. The words hit harder than she probably intended. Adrian folded the treaty throat tight. He taught me nothing. That's the problem. Seraphine's expression softened. Fractionally. Then you're learning fast. Come on. The council's waiting. Uku. The council chamber felt smaller with tension filling every corner. Marcus Thorne stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, glaring at Adrian's treaty draft like it had personally insulted him. This is surrender, he said flatly. We're handing Vesper to the consortium on a silver platter. We're buying time, Adrian countered. Time to fortify. Time to establish legitimacy. Time to what? Marcus slammed his hand on the table. Become another colonial holding? Another resource to be bled dry? Better than being a mass grave, Seraphine cut in, which is what we'll be if we fight them head on. A younger council member, Thomas Kerr, who oversaw the island's mining operations, leaned forward. What guarantees do we have that Harrow will honor this treaty? That the consortium won't just invade anyway once they've mapped our defenses? Adrian met his eyes. None. We have no guarantees, but right now we're negotiating from a position of weakness. The alternative is hoping they get bored and leave. They won't, Thomas said quietly. They know what's under our mountains. Silver deposits worth more than half of England's annual revenue. They're not leaving without it. The room went still. Adrian looked at Seraphine. Is that true? She nodded. Your father kept the full extent of the reserves classified. Even most of the council didn't know. She paused. Vesper isn't just strategically valuable, it's a treasury waiting to be cracked open. Adrian's stomach dropped. And Harrow knows? If he didn't before, he does now. Someone's been feeding him information. The words landed like a blade. Adrian's mind raced. Who? Seraphine's expression went dark. That's what we're trying to figure out. Marcus straightened. We've had 3 supply shipments intercepted in the past 6 months. Routes your father personally established. Someone with access to his networks is talking. Adrian's pulse quickened. Who had that access? Marcus's gaze shifted to a thin man sitting at the far end of the table, Lord Malcolm Vane, the island's chief administrator. Malcolm looked up, eyes wide with something that might have been fear or might have been guilt. I handled logistics, Malcolm said quickly, trade routes, shipment schedules, but I never what? Seraphine's voice was ice. Never wondered why our supply ships kept getting boarded? Never questioned how the consortium knew exactly when and where to intercept them? Malcolm's face went pale. I reported every incident to Duke Cedric, every single one. If there's a leak, it's not from me. Then who? Marcus demanded. The room erupted into accusations and denials. Adrian watched the council tear itself apart, distrust spreading like poison. This was how kingdoms fell, not from external force, but from internal collapse. His father had built Vesper on secrecy, and secrecy required absolute trust. The moment that trust fractured, everything crumbled. Enough, Adrian said. His voice cut through the noise. We don't have time for this. We have 36 hours to finalize the treaty. If there's a traitor, we'll deal with them after we survive. Seraphine nodded. Agreed. We proceed with negotiations, but we double the watch on the harbor. Nobody leaves the island. Nobody communicates with the fleet. Understood? The council murmured assent. Malcolm stood abruptly. I need to check the warehouse manifests. Make sure we can fulfill the trade quotas you're promising Harrow. He left before anyone could object. Seraphine watched him go, eyes narrow. I don't trust him. You don't trust anyone, Adrian said. She looked at him. On Vesper, that's kept me alive. Night fell over the island like a held breath. Adrian stood on the battlements of the old fortress, the ancient stone keep at Vesper's highest point, built centuries ago by the first refugees. From here, he could see the entire settlement spread below, lamplight in windows, smoke from chimneys, people living lives they believed were safe. They were wrong. Safety was an illusion his father had maintained through brutal pragmatism, and now Adrian had to maintain it through bluffs and treaties he barely understood. The fortress door creaked open behind him. Seraphine emerged carrying 2 tin cups and a bottle of something that smelled stronger than ship fuel. You look like you need this, she said, pouring. Adrian took the cup, knocked it back. Fire scorched his throat. What is this? Island whiskey. Brewed from moss and desperation. She poured herself a measure. Your father loved it. Adrian stared into his cup. Did you know him well? As well as anyone. Seraphine leaned against the battlement. He was brilliant, ruthless, lonely. She paused. He talked about you sometimes. Adrian's chest tightened. What did he say? That you were smarter than him, kinder, that you'd hate him for what he'd done. She looked at Adrian. He was right about all of it. Adrian's hands gripped the cup until his knuckles went white. Why didn't he just tell me? About Vesper, about any of this. Because he was terrified you'd try to fix it. Seraphine's voice softened. Your father knew Vesper couldn't last. Not forever. The secrecy, the isolation, it was always temporary. He just hoped it would outlast him. Adrian's laugh was bitter. Well, it didn't. No. She raised her cup. To dead men and their impossible inheritances. They drank in silence. Then Seraphine spoke again. You asked me earlier why your father never prepared us for invasion. I didn't tell you the whole truth. Adrian looked at her. He did prepare us, just not the way you'd think. She set her cup down. 3 years ago, Cedric started moving silver reserves off the island. Small amounts. Untraceable. He created a network of hidden accounts across Europe. Why? Insurance. If Vesper fell, the people could escape with enough resources to rebuild somewhere else. He was preparing for evacuation, not defense. Adrian's mind reeled. So he knew this would happen. He knew it was possible. Seraphine met his eyes. Your father wasn't trying to save Vesper, Adrian. He was trying to save the people. There's a difference. Before Adrian could respond, an explosion tore through the night. The blast came from the harbor, a column of fire erupting into the sky, bright enough to turn fog into daylight. Alarms rang across the settlement. People poured into the streets, shouting, panicking. Adrian and Seraphine ran. They reached the harbor to find chaos. One of the warehouses was engulfed in flames, smoke billowing into the cavern ceiling. The docks were in disarray, militia scrambling, water brigades forming, casualties being dragged from the wreckage. Seraphine grabbed a lieutenant. What happened? Sabotage, the man gasped. Someone set charges in the munitions storage, took out half our powder reserves. Adrian's blood turned to ice. Where's Malcolm? The lieutenant's face went grim. He was seen near the warehouse an hour ago. Seraphine drew her sword. Find him. Now. Bates. They found Malcolm in the fortress chapel, a small stone room beneath the keep where Vesper's refugees had prayed for 2 centuries. He stood before the altar, hands shaking, face streaked with soot and tears. Adrian stepped inside, Seraphine flanking him with a dozen armed soldiers. Malcolm, Adrian said carefully. We need to talk. Malcolm didn't turn. I'm sorry. His voice cracked. I'm so sorry. For what? For all of it. Malcolm's shoulders shook. The intercepted shipments, the leaked routes, the explosion. He finally turned, eyes red and hollow. I gave Harrow everything. The room went dead silent. Adrian felt reality tilt. Why? Because he promised me freedom. Malcolm's laugh was broken. 30 years I've served this island. 30 years managing logistics for a kingdom that doesn't exist. Do you know what that does to a person? Living in hiding, never traveling, never seeing anything beyond this fog. So you sold us out. Seraphine's voice was deadly quiet. I negotiated our surrender. Malcolm straightened, defiant. Harrow promised clemency. Relocation for those who want it. Integration into the mainland economy. Real lives for real people. Adrian stepped closer. You destroyed our bargaining position. Without munitions, we can't even threaten defense. There was never going to be a defense. Malcolm's voice rose. You were negotiating a treaty that would have turned us into indentured servants. Harrow's terms are better, faster. He paused. Merciful. Merciful, Seraphine repeated. She moved so fast Malcolm didn't have time to flinch. Her blade pressed against his throat. Tell me, did his mercy cover the 3 men who died in that explosion? Malcolm's face crumpled. That wasn't supposed to happen. The charges were meant to disable, not kill. Seraphine's hand shook with rage. You're a traitor and a fool. I'm a realist. Malcolm's eyes found Adrian. Your father kept us in a cage. You were going to keep us here forever. At least Harrow offers a way out. Adrian's mind raced through calculations and consequences. The treaty was dead. Their defenses were crippled. The council would demand Malcolm's execution, and Harrow now knew they were broken. Every option led to the same place, annihilation. Unless... Adrian looked at Malcolm. When are you supposed to signal Harrow? Malcolm hesitated. When? Adrian repeated. Dawn. I'm supposed to light a beacon on the North Tower to confirm the munitions are destroyed. Adrian turned to Seraphine. Don't light it. She lowered her blade. What are you thinking? We give Harrow what he expects. Chaos, weakness, desperation. Adrian's voice grew harder. But we control the narrative. Malcolm's going to send that signal, and he's going to tell Harrow exactly what I want him to hear. Malcolm's eyes widened. What? That Vesper's leadership has collapsed, that the council's turned on itself, that the island's ready to surrender, but only to Harrow personally. He has to come ashore to negotiate terms. Seraphine caught on immediately. You're setting a trap. Adrian nodded. Harrow thinks he's won. He'll come in light, minimal guard, maximum arrogance, and that's when we take him. You can't, Malcolm whispered. He'll have contingencies, backup plans. If anything happens to him, then the fleet moves in and we're finished, Adrian finished. I know, that's why nothing's going to happen to him. We're going to negotiate, for real this time. His eyes locked onto Malcolm. And you're going to help us. Malcolm's face went ashen. He'll know I betrayed him. You already betrayed everyone, Seraphine said coldly. Now you get to pick which betrayal you die for. The next 18 hours moved with brutal efficiency. Adrian drafted new terms, harsher ones, openly exploitative ones, designed to make Harrow feel like he'd crushed them completely. Seraphine positioned her best fighters in the fortress throne room, hidden behind tapestries and false walls. The council, fractured and furious, agreed to the plan only because there were no other options left. And Malcolm sent the signal. At dawn, a beacon lit on the north tower. 3 long flashes, the code Harrow had given him. Adrian watched from the battlements as a single ship detached from the fleet and moved toward the harbor. Smaller. Faster. Harrow's personal vessel. He's coming, Seraphine said beside him. Are you ready? Adrian's hands were steady, but his mind was screaming. No. But we're doing this anyway. They descended to the throne room, a cavernous space carved from bedrock, lined with ancient stone and shadows. Adrian sat in his father's chair, a position he'd never imagined occupying. Around him, hidden soldiers waited with crossbows and blades. The doors opened. Captain Edmund Harrow strode in, flanked by 6 guards. He wore victory like a uniform, confident, relaxed, utterly convinced of his control. His eyes swept the room, noting the damaged walls, the exhausted faces, the unmistakable stench of defeat. Mr. Vale? Harrow said pleasantly. You wanted to negotiate. Adrian stood. I wanted to surrender. Properly. Harrow's smile widened. Smart man. Adrian gestured to the table where the new treaty waited. These are my terms. Vesper becomes a protectorate of the consortium. We provide labor access to the silver mines. We allow permanent military presence. In exchange, the population remains intact and unharmed. Harrow picked up the document, skimmed it. His smile never wavered. Acceptable. You've learned quickly how power works. I've learned how survival works, Adrian corrected. There's a difference. Not really. Harrow set the document down. Power is survival. The strong make rules, the weak follow them. Your father understood that. I'm glad you do too. He pulled out a pen, moved to sign. Adrian's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. This was the moment, the hinge point. If Harrow signed, Vesper became property. If Adrian moved now... Harrow's hand paused above the paper. He looked up, expression shifting. Where's Lord Vane? Adrian's blood froze. What? Malcolm. Harrow's eyes narrowed. He should be here. This was his victory as much as mine. He's securing the harbor, Adrian said smoothly, making sure your fleet can dock safely. Harrow studied him. Then he looked at his guards. Check the perimeter. Something's wrong. The guards moved. Too fast. Seraphine's soldiers dropped from the shadows, crossbow bolts flying, steel flashing. 3 of Harrow's men went down in the first seconds. The others drew weapons. The throne room exploded into violence. Adrian lunged for Harrow, but the captain was faster, blade out, defensive stance perfect. Their weapons met with a shriek of metal. Clever boy, Harrow hissed. But not clever enough. They fought across the chamber. Adrian was younger, faster, but Harrow was trained. Every movement precise, every strike calculated. Around them, the battle raged. Seraphine cut through Harrow's remaining guards like wheat. Then Malcolm appeared in the doorway. His face was devastated. Harrow saw him, saw the guilt written across every feature, and understanding dawned. You, Harrow breathed, you set this up. Malcolm's voice broke. I had no choice. You always have a choice. Harrow disengaged from Adrian, backing toward the door. And you just made the worst one of your miserable life. He pulled something from his coat, a flare gun, and fired into the ceiling. Red light exploded through the stone chamber, visible through the fortress windows, bright enough to be seen from the harbor. A signal. Harrow smiled through blood-streaked teeth. You wanted a trap? Here's mine. The sound reached them seconds later, a distant roar that grew louder, closer, impossible to mistake. Cannons. The fleet had opened fire. Itas. The fortress shook as the first rounds hit the outer walls. Stone cracked. Dust rained from the ceiling. Adrian stumbled, ears ringing, and Harrow used the distraction to bolt, running for the door with inhuman speed. Seraphine threw a dagger. It caught Harrow in the shoulder, spun him sideways, but he kept moving, out the door, down the corridor, vanishing into the chaos. After him, Seraphine shouted, but Adrian was frozen, staring at Malcolm. The older man stood in the doorway, tears streaming down his face, and the weight of what he'd done finally settling into his bones. I just wanted us to be free, Malcolm whispered. Then another cannonball hit, closer this time, and the ceiling above Malcolm exploded. Stone crushed him instantly. There was no scream, no last words, just silence and dust and blood spreading across ancient floors. Adrian couldn't breathe. The fortress was collapsing. The harbor was burning. The fleet was shelling the cliffs with methodical precision. Everything his father had built, everything 300 years of survival had maintained, was coming apart in real time. And Adrian had accelerated it. By trying to trap Harrow, he'd triggered the invasion. By trusting Malcolm, he'd lost any chance at negotiation. By believing survival was possible, he'd guaranteed destruction. Seraphine grabbed his arm. We need to evacuate, now. Adrian looked at her. To where? The caves. The forest. Anywhere but here. Her face was carved from desperation. We can still save people if we move fast. And then what? Adrian's voice cracked. Hide forever? Watch them hunt us down settlement by settlement? Seraphine's grip tightened. Then we fight until there's nothing left to fight for. Because that's what your father would have done. Adrian stared at her, this woman who'd spent her life defending an impossible dream, and understood with perfect clarity that she was wrong. His father would have run. His father would have saved himself and let Vesper burn because that's what survival meant to Cedric Blackthorne, preserving the self at any cost. But Adrian wasn't his father, and maybe that was the only thing he'd inherited that actually mattered. He pulled free from Seraphine's grip. Get everyone to the northern passages, the hidden routes to the mountains. He looked her dead in the eye. I'm going after Harrow. That's suicide. Probably. But if I can capture him, if I can drag him in front of his fleet as a hostage, maybe they'll stop firing long enough for people to escape. Seraphine's expression shattered. You don't owe us this. Adrian's laugh was raw. I owe you everything. You. These people, this place. My father stole 30 years from you by keeping you trapped in secrecy. The least I can do is buy you a chance to be free. He turned toward the corridor where Harrow had fled, smoke billowing, the fortress groaning around them like a dying giant. Seraphine called after him. Adrian. He didn't look back, because looking back meant seeing all the ways this could fail, and failure was the only option he had left. Adrian found Harrow in the lighthouse, the ancient tower at the island's northern tip, the highest point on Vesper, where warning fires had burned for centuries. Harrow stood at the top, clutching his wounded shoulder, blood soaking his coat. Below, the island burned. Ships bombarded the settlement. People fled through smoke and rubble. The kingdom was dying, and Harrow watched with satisfaction. Adrian climbed the last steps, sword drawn, lungs screaming. It's over, he said. Harrow turned, smiled. Yes, it is. Call off the attack. Adrian's voice shook. You've won. Take the silver. Take the island. Just stop killing them. Harrow laughed, genuine, delighted. You still don't understand. This isn't about silver. It's about precedent. He gestured to the burning settlement below. Hidden kingdoms can't exist, Adrian. The moment one survives, others will try. We're not conquering Vesper. We're erasing it. Adrian's blood turned to ice. You're slaughtering them. We're preventing future complications. Harrow's eyes glittered. Your father knew this day would come. That's why he never let you close. Because he knew you'd try to save them. And he knew you'd fail. Adrian moved forward, blade raised. Harrow pulled a pistol. The shot cracked across the lighthouse. Pain exploded in Adrian's side, white-hot, blinding. He dropped to one knee, vision blurring. Harrow stepped closer. Your father was a pragmatist. You're just a boy playing at titles he doesn't understand. Adrian's hand found the iron key in his pocket, the key his father had hidden in the coffin, and something clicked. Not a key to a door, a detonator. His father's final contingency. The thing Cedric had planned if Vesper ever fell. Adrian looked up at Harrow through pain and smoke and the crystallizing realization that his father had always known this moment would come. And he'd left one last option. Scorched earth. Adrian's fingers closed around the key. He twisted. Deep beneath the fortress, in chambers carved centuries ago, charges his father had placed began to ignite. The island trembled. Harrow's expression shifted from triumph to horror. What did you do? Adrian smiled through blood. I chose the ending my father couldn't. The lighthouse lurched, stone cracked, and far below, the mountain that held Vesper together began tearing itself apart. Adrian collapsed, darkness closing in, the sound of destruction rising like a final prayer. And his last thought, before consciousness left him, maybe survival isn't about living. Maybe it's about deciding what you're willing to die for. Pain was the first thing that told Adrian he was still alive. White-hot agony radiating from his side where Harrow's bullet had torn through flesh and muscle. His lungs burned with each shallow breath. His vision swam between darkness and the blurred orange glow of fire consuming everything below. The lighthouse was collapsing, stone grinding against stone, the entire structure tilting as the mountain beneath Vesper tore itself apart from Adrian's father's final contingency. Explosive charges placed years ago in case the unthinkable happened. In case the kingdom needed to be erased rather than conquered. Adrian had triggered them, had chosen annihilation over surrender, and now he was dying in the ruins of that choice. Harrow's voice cut through the roar of destruction. You mad bastard! You've killed us all! Adrian forced his eyes open. Harrow was pressed against the lighthouse wall, face pale with shock and rage. Blood still poured from his shoulder wound. Below them, the tower's foundation cracked with sounds like cannon fire. Not all of us, Adrian gasped. Just you and me. The lighthouse lurched violently. Both men were thrown to the floor. Stone blocks began raining from the ceiling. Through the narrow windows, Adrian could see the island fragmenting, cliffs sliding into the sea, the fortress crumbling, fires spreading through what remained of the settlement. But he could also see people. Seraphine's evacuation routes working, streams of refugees pouring into the northern passages, disappearing into mountain caves the consortium fleet couldn't reach. They were moving fast, organized, surviving. That was the calculus Adrian had made when he twisted that key. If Vesper was going to fall, it would fall on his terms. Not as a conquered territory to be exploited, but as a deliberate sacrifice that bought his people time to escape. His father had prepared for this ending, had built the infrastructure for total destruction because he'd understood something Adrian was only now learning. Power wasn't about winning. It was about choosing how you lost. And sometimes the only way to protect what mattered was to destroy everything else. Harrow crawled toward the stairwell, desperation overriding dignity. His fleet's still out there. They'll hunt down every survivor. This changes nothing. Adrian grabbed a fallen stone block, used it to drag himself upright. Agony screamed through his body. He doesn't care. Watch them try. He pulled himself to the window overlooking the harbor. Through smoke and chaos, he could see Harrow's fleet in disarray. The explosions had triggered massive rock slides. Tons of cliff face were cascading into the water, creating waves that swamped the smaller vessels. 2 ships had already capsized. The others were scrambling to retreat beyond the danger zone. But more importantly, the hidden sea passage Seraphine controlled, the narrow channel that was the only safe route through the reefs surrounding Vesper, was collapsing. Adrian watched as the cliff walls on either side began sliding inward, grinding together like teeth. Seraphine had triggered her own contingency. She was sealing the harbor, trapping the invasion fleet inside a killing box of stone and water. Harrow saw it too. His face went ashen. No, 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 no. The passage collapsed completely. Millions of tons of rock crashed into the channel, sending a wave 50 feet high surging back toward the trapped fleet. Ships tried to turn, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The wave hit like a hammer. 3 vessels were smashed against the cliffs instantly. Others were driven into each other, hulls splintering, masts snapping. The water inside the harbor became a maelstrom of wreckage and drowning men. Adrian watched it happen and felt nothing. No triumph, no regret, just the cold certainty that this was always how it had to end. Vesper couldn't survive contact with the outside world. His father had known that, had spent 30 years delaying the inevitable, and when delay was no longer possible, he'd left instructions for total erasure. Adrian had just executed those instructions, had become the executioner his inheritance demanded. That was the price of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. You didn't get to be good. You didn't get to be merciful. You got to make impossible choices and live with the weight of every life those choices destroyed. Harrow's voice was raw with fury. You're a monster. Adrian looked at him through blood and smoke. I'm my father's son. The lighthouse gave another violent lurch. The floor beneath them split. Harrow scrambled backward, but there was nowhere left to go. The stairwell had collapsed. The walls were cracking. They were trapped at the top of a tower that was seconds from falling into the sea. Through the chaos, a sound cut through, a voice amplified by a speaking trumpet, strong and clear despite the destruction. Adrian, Seraphine! He dragged himself to the north-facing window. Below, impossibly, a ship was maneuvering through the wreckage, one of Vesper's smaller vessels, piloted with suicidal precision through debris and waves. Seraphine stood at the bow, rope ladder already being prepared. Jump! She shouted. The distance was impossible. 30 feet of empty air to a moving deck surrounded by wreckage. Adrian looked down at his blood-soaked side, at his shaking hands, at the weakness flooding his limbs. He looked at Harrow, who was pressed against the far wall, eyes wide with the realization that he was going to die here. Some part of Adrian, the part that was still the boy who'd wanted his father's approval, who'd believed in honor and mercy, wanted to offer Harrow the escape, to extend a hand and prove he was better than this. But that boy had died in the throne room when Malcolm's betrayal had taught Adrian the final lesson about survival. The world didn't reward mercy. It punished hesitation. And the only way to protect the people you loved was to become someone they might not recognize. Adrian climbed onto the window ledge. Wind tore at him. His vision grayed at the edges. Every instinct screamed this was suicide. He jumped. The fall lasted forever. In no time at all. Wind, smoke, the distant roar of collapsing stone. Then impact. Adrian hit the ship's deck hard, ribs cracking, consciousness flickering. Hands grabbed him. Voices shouted. The ship lurched away from the lighthouse. Behind them, the tower finally gave way. It toppled like a felled tree, crashing into the burning wreckage of the harbor with a sound like the end of the world. Captain Edmund Harrow went down with it. No escape. No mercy, just gravity and consequence. Adrian watched it fall through dimming vision and thought. This is what power costs. Not gold, not titles. The willingness to watch your enemies die and know you put them there. Then, darkness took him. He woke to pain and the smell of herbs. His side was wrapped in tight bandages that pulled with every breath. A lantern swung overhead, casting shadows across rough stone walls. Cave walls. They were underground. Seraphine sat beside him, face smudged with soot, eyes red from exhaustion or tears or both. When she saw him wake, something in her expression cracked. "You idiot," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "You stupid, brilliant idiot." Adrian tried to speak. His throat was raw. "Did they—" "Most of them." Seraphine's hand found his. "We got most of them out. The northern passages held. The caves are deep enough that the fleet can't reach them." She paused. "We lost maybe 300. Out of 3,000. Adrian closed his eyes. Mathematics of survival. 9 out of 10 saved meant success. But the 300 who died in the collapse, in the fires, in the desperate evacuation, they were the price. And he'd paid it without asking permission. That was what separated leaders from everyone else. Leaders made decisions that turned people into numbers, into acceptable losses, into the cost of doing business with survival. His father had done it for 30 years. And now Adrian understood why Cedric had never let him close. Why he'd kept his son at arm's length, treating him with cold distance that had felt like cruelty. It wasn't cruelty. It was protection. Protection from becoming the kind of person who could make those calculations and still sleep at night. Except Adrian wasn't sleeping. Wasn't sure he ever would again. The fleet? He managed. Seraphine's expression hardened. Destroyed. 12 ships sunk in the harbor. 5 more damaged beyond repair trying to escape through the wreckage. She paused. 3 made it out. They're heading back to England with news that Vesper is gone. Adrian's mind worked through the implications. They'll report total loss. No survivors, no island. That's the idea. Seraphine squeezed his hand. You erased us, just like your father planned. The consortium got their invasion fleet annihilated. The noble houses who backed them lost fortunes. And Vesper becomes a cautionary tale. The hidden kingdom that killed everyone who tried to find it. And us? We disappear. Scatter. The 3,000 survivors split into groups small enough to vanish into Europe's ports and cities. We take new names, new lives. She met his eyes. We survive by becoming invisible again, but this time by choice, not necessity. Adrian stared at the cave ceiling, his father's final gift. Not the island, not the kingdom, the evacuation plan, the hidden accounts. The preparation for the day's secrecy failed. Cedric hadn't been protecting Vesper. He'd been protecting the people. And the only way to do that was to be willing to destroy everything else. How long was I out? Adrian asked. 2 days. Seraphine stood, moved to the cave entrance. We're in the deep shelters, food for months, medical supplies. Your father stocked them years ago. She turned back. He really did prepare for this. Adrian forced himself to sit up. Agony shot through his side. Where do we go? Seraphine returned with a leather folder. Inside were documents, identity papers, banknotes, shipping manifests. All prepared, all waiting. Your father set up relocation networks across 6 countries. Portugal, Denmark, the Americas. Places where refugees with money can disappear. She set the folder beside him. You can go anywhere. Be anyone. And you? I'm staying with my people, making sure everyone gets out safely. It'll take months, maybe a year. She paused. After that? I don't know. Maybe I'll finally see what the world looks like when you're not hiding from it. Adrian looked at the documents, at the future his father had built from paranoia and pragmatism, at the escape route that had cost 300 lives to activate. I'm not leaving, he said. Seraphine's expression shifted. Adrian, not until everyone's safe, not until the last person is relocated. He met her eyes. You said my father spent 30 years protecting these people. Fine. I'm finishing what he started. You've already done more than anyone could ask. Adrian's laugh was bitter. I destroyed their home, killed their friends, turned them into refugees. The least I can do is make sure they survive it. Seraphine studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. All right, but you need to heal first. Can't evacuate anyone if you bleed out in a cave. She left him alone with his pain and his thoughts. Adrian lay back, staring at shadows dancing across stone. His mind kept returning to the lighthouse, to Harrow falling, to the moment he'd chosen to jump and leave his enemy to die. That was the moment he'd become his father, not when he'd signed documents or negotiated treaties. When he'd looked at another human being and calculated they were worth less than the people he was protecting. That calculation was the real inheritance. The ability to make that choice and carry the weight of it. To become someone capable of doing what needed to be done, regardless of what it cost your soul. His father had lived with that weight for 3 decades, had carried it in silence because sharing it meant destroying the one person he'd tried to protect, his son. Now Adrian understood. And understanding was its own kind of death, the death of innocence, the death of the belief that good people didn't make terrible choices. Good people made the worst choices of all, because they were the only ones who understood what those choices cost. 3 days later, Adrian was mobile enough to walk the caves. Seraphine led him through the shelter network, a vast warren of tunnels and chambers carved over centuries. Families huddled around small fires. Children whispered in the dark. People who'd lost everything except the clothes on their backs and each other. They recognized him. The Duke's son, the one who'd destroyed the island to save them. Reactions were mixed. Some nodded in gratitude. Others turned away. A few stared with open hatred. Adrian didn't blame them. He'd given them survival, but he'd taken their home. That was a trade not everyone would have chosen. In one chamber, he found Thomas Kerr, the mining engineer from the council. The man was organizing supply distribution, keeping people fed and sheltered with the same efficiency he'd used managing Vesper's operations. Thomas saw Adrian and his jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "We're rationing the medical supplies," Thomas said. "Prioritizing the wounded and sick. Food's holding, water's clean." He paused. "We'll make it." Adrian nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Thomas's voice was flat. "Thank your father. He's the one who planned for this." He looked at Adrian. "Did you know? About the charges under the mountain?" "No." Adrian met his eyes. "I found the trigger by accident. Made the choice in about 3 seconds. 3 seconds to destroy 300 years. Thomas's expression was unreadable. "Must be nice, and having that kind of power." "It's not." They stood in silence. Finally, Thomas spoke again. His voice was quieter. "My wife died in the collapse. She was helping evacuate the lower quarters when the fortress came down." Adrian's chest constricted. "I'm sorry." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know. And I know she'd have died anyway if the consortium had taken the island. They weren't here to occupy. They were here to erase. Your choice gave her death meaning, made it part of something larger." He paused. "I'm not sure that makes it better, but it makes it bearable." He walked away before Adrian could respond. Seraphine appeared beside him. "You all right?" Adrian watched Thomas disappear into the tunnels. "No. But I don't think I'm supposed to be." They continued through the caves. Eventually they reached the command center, a chamber where Seraphine and her lieutenants coordinated the evacuation. Maps covered the walls showing routes, safe houses, contact points. It was methodical, professional, the product of years of preparation nobody had wanted to use. "Status report," Seraphine said to her second-in-command. A scarred woman named Victoria stepped forward. "First wave departed yesterday. 200 people headed for Lisbon on fishing boats. Documents are solid. They'll blend in as Portuguese laborers within a week. Second wave leaves tomorrow, 150 to Copenhagen." She paused. "Lord Marcus is leading the third wave, 300 to the American colonies." "Marcus is going to America?" Adrian asked. "He volunteered." Victoria's expression softened, said he was tired of hiding on islands, wanted somewhere big enough to disappear properly. Seraphine nodded. "And the rest?" "Staggered departures over the next 6 months. Small groups, different destinations. By this time next year, Vesper will be a ghost story. Nobody left to confirm it existed." Adrian processed that. 3,000 people scattered across the world. An entire culture dissolved into diaspora. The death of a kingdom accomplished through evacuation rather than conquest. His father had understood this was the only ending available. No dramatic last stands, no glorious defenses, just quiet dissolution and the hope that scattered people could rebuild individual lives even if they couldn't rebuild their collective home. "What about the island itself?" Adrian asked. Seraphine walked to a map showing Vesper's geography. The collapse destabilized the entire northern half. Cliffs are still sliding into the sea. The harbor's buried under millions of tons of rock. The fortress is rubble. She traced the coastline. Give it a few years and Vesper will be uninhabitable. Just cliffs and ruins and graves. "So we really did destroy it. We made it worthless," Seraphine corrected. "There's a difference. The silver's still there, but it's under so much collapsed stone that mining it would cost more than it's worth. The harbor can't be rebuilt without years of excavation. The strategic value is gone." She looked at Adrian. "You didn't just save the people. You saved them from being found again, by making sure there's nothing left to find." "Exactly." Adrian stared at the map, at the red marks indicating collapsed structures and unstable terrain, his father's kingdom erased. Not by enemy action, but by his own son's decision. That was the legacy he'd claimed. Not power, not wealth. The willingness to destroy what you loved to protect who you loved. It was the most honest definition of duty he'd ever encountered. And it was eating him alive. Mas. That night, Adrian stood at the cave mouth overlooking the sea. The fog had finally cleared. For the first time in weeks, he could see stars. The water below was dark and calm, giving no indication of the violence that had unfolded there days ago. Behind him, 3,000 people slept in caves. Ahead of him, an entire world neither knew nor cared about their existence. And in the space between, Adrian Vale stood alone with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Seraphine found him there an hour before dawn. She didn't speak, just stood beside him, sharing the silence. Finally, Adrian broke it. "Do you hate me?" She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was careful. "I hate what you had to do. I hate that it was necessary. I hate that your father put you in a position where destroying everything was the best option." She paused. "But no, I don't hate you, even though your entire life's work is rubble. My life's work was keeping these people alive." She gestured back toward the caves. "They're alive, Adrian, scared, displaced, grieving, but breathing. That's the only metric that matters. At what cost? 300 dead." Seraphine's voice didn't waver. An island destroyed, a culture scattered, and two people standing here wondering if they made the right choice. She looked at him. "That's the cost. And we pay it, because the alternative was worse." Adrian's hands gripped the stone ledge. "I keep seeing Harrow fall, keep hearing the lighthouse collapse." "I made that happen, Seraphine. I chose it." "Yes, you did." Her voice was hard. "And you'll carry that for the rest of your life. Welcome to command. It doesn't get easier. You just get better at living with it." "How?" "You don't." She met his eyes. "You survive. You do the work. You make sure their sacrifice meant something. And when the weight gets too heavy, you remember that the people who died would have died anyway. At least your way, they died buying time for others to live. That's not comfort. It's not supposed to be." Seraphine's expression was steel. "Comfort is for people who don't make life and death decisions. You gave that up when you twisted that key." They stood in silence as the sun began to rise, the first light in days that wasn't fire. Far below, on the water, Adrian spotted movement. Ships. 3 of them. Small. Flying no flags. Moving carefully through the wreckage-choked waters toward the island. Seraphine saw them too. Her hand moved to her sword. "Wait," Adrian said. He squinted at the lead vessel. "That's a Vesper boat." The ship drew closer. A figure stood at the bow, tall, broad-shouldered, familiar. Wren, the former naval captain who'd gotten Adrian to the island in the first place, who'd been captured during the initial boarding by Harrow's fleet, who Adrian had assumed was dead. The ships anchored in the debris field. Boats were lowered. Wren climbed into the first one, along with maybe 40 other people, survivors from the consortium fleet, but their hands were bound. They were prisoners. Wren's boat reached the rocks below the cave entrance. He looked up, saw Adrian and Seraphine, and his grim expression cracked into something like relief. "Thought you might need some bargaining chips," he called up. Adrian and Seraphine descended to meet him. Wren climbed from the boat, soaked and exhausted, but alive. Behind him, the prisoners were hauled onto the rocks. Consortium sailors, a few officers, and 2 men in nobleman's clothing Adrian recognized from his father's funeral. Lord Percival Ashford, and his son. "We pulled them from the water," Wren explained. "They were on one of the ships that capsized in the harbor. Most of the crew drowned. These were the lucky ones." His smile was sharp, or unlucky, depending how you look at it. Adrian stared at Ashford, the man who'd shown up at Cedric's funeral asking too many questions. Who'd sent men to hunt Adrian through Grimsby? Who'd likely financed Harrow's invasion? Ashford met his gaze with pure hatred. "You destroyed everything," Ashford spat. "Millions in ships, hundreds of men, a fortune in lost opportunity. The consortium will what?" Adrian stepped closer. "Come after an island that doesn't exist anymore? Avenge a fleet that got caught in a natural disaster?" He gestured to the ruins around them. "There's nothing here to claim, nothing to conquer, just rock and water and bodies." Ashford's face went red. "You can't—" "I already did." Adrian's voice dropped to something cold and final. "And you're going to go back to England and tell every noble house, every investor, every ambitious lord looking for easy wealth, Vesper Isle is gone. Anyone who comes looking ends up at the bottom of the sea. You're going to tell them my father's kingdom was destroyed in the invasion, that there are no survivors, no treasure, no reason to ever come back. And if I refuse, then you stay here, Adrian said flatly, buried in the rubble with everyone else. Your choice. Ashford's jaw worked. His son looked terrified. Finally, the old lord nodded. Fine. We'll deliver your message. Good. Adrian gestured to Wren. Get them on a boat. Give them enough supplies to reach England. Nothing more. As Wren organized the prisoner's departure, Seraphine leaned close to Adrian. You're letting them go? After everything? I'm sending a message, Adrian corrected. One that'll spread through every noble house in Europe. Vesper is dead. Hunting it costs everything. He watched Ashford being loaded into a boat. Fear is more effective than walls, and if they don't believe him, then they'll send another fleet and find nothing but ruins and fog. Adrian's expression was carved from stone. We'll already be gone. Stack. The evacuation took 6 months. 6 months of careful, methodical dissolution. Groups of 10 or 20 leaving every few days on fishing boats, merchant vessels, ships arranged through networks his father had built. Each departure took a piece of Vesper with it, traditions, stories, memories that would scatter across the world and slowly fade into family histories nobody quite believed. Adrian stayed until the end, watched 3,000 people disappear into new lives, helped coordinate safe houses and identity documents, used every connection his father's name carried to smooth the way for refugees nobody could officially acknowledge. Seraphine stayed too, working herself to exhaustion, making sure every person had a destination and a plan. By the final month, her hair had gone gray at the temples. Her hand shook when she thought nobody was looking. They were standing in the emptying command center when she finally asked the question that had hung between them for months. What happens to us when this is over? Adrian had thought about it. Every day, every sleepless night. I don't know. You can go back to England, claim your father's estate, be Duke Blackthorn. Seraphine's voice was carefully neutral. Live the life you were supposed to have. Adrian looked at the maps on the wall, at the red marks indicating completed evacuations, at the evidence of a kingdom dismantled. Can I? Just go back to balls in Parliament and pretending none of this happened? It's what your father did for 30 years, and it destroyed him. Adrian met her eyes. I'm not him, Seraphine. I can't do what he did. Carry this alone. Pretend the weight isn't there. She studied him. Then what? I help you finish this. Make sure the last people get out safe. And then, he paused. I don't know. Find somewhere new. Somewhere nobody knows the name Blackthorn or Vale or anything I used to be. You're talking about disappearing. I'm talking about surviving. Adrian's voice roughened. Everything I was before Vesper is dead. The dutiful son, the ignored heir, the man who thought titles mattered. That person died in the lighthouse. I can't resurrect him just because it would be convenient. Seraphine's expression shifted. Something vulnerable cracked through the steel. You could come with us. The final group. We're heading to Portugal, small village on the coast, quiet, forgotten. Adrian's breath caught. As what? As whoever you choose to be. She stepped closer. No titles, no kingdoms, no weight but what we choose to carry. She paused. I know it's not the inheritance you wanted. It's the inheritance I need, Adrian said quietly, because everything else died with the island. They stood in the empty command center surrounded by the ghosts of 300 years. Outside, the last refugees were preparing to depart. The caves would be abandoned within days. Vesper Isle would return to the sea and fog, remembered only by survivors who'd slowly forget the details as they built new lives. And Adrian Vale, Duke Blackthorn, destroyer of kingdoms, executioner of his own inheritance, would disappear with them. It was the only honest ending available. Not triumph, not tragedy, just survival purchased at the cost of everything that came before. His father would have understood, might even have approved, but Cedric wasn't here to see it. And maybe that was mercy. The final boat left on a gray morning when the fog rolled in heavy and complete. 30 people, the last of Vesper's refugees. Seraphine and Adrian were among them. As the boat pulled away from the rocks, Adrian looked back at the island one final time. The cliffs were scarred and broken. The fortress was a ruin. The harbor was a grave. Nothing remained of the kingdom his father had ruled for 3 decades. But the people remained, scattered, changed, grieving, alive. That was the trade. The kingdom for its people, the symbol for the substance, the past for the future. Adrian had made that trade, had twisted the key and watched everything burn, and now he lived with the weight of 300 graves and 3,000 new beginnings. It was the heaviest thing he'd ever carried, and the only thing worth carrying at all. Seraphine's hand found his as the island disappeared into fog. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. They'd survived together, failed together, and now they'd disappear together into a world that would never know what they'd protected or what it had cost. The boat sailed into open water, into uncertainty, into lives they'd have to invent from scratch. And behind them, Vesper Isle vanished into mist and myth, a kingdom that had existed for 300 years and would be remembered for maybe 30 more before fading completely into legend. The Duke's ghost was laid to rest, the survivors sailed on, and Adrian Vale learned the final lesson his father had never taught him. That true power wasn't about what you could control. It was about what you could let go. Even when letting go meant destroying everything you'd fought to save. Even when the only victory available was survival. Even when survival looked like defeat to everyone watching. That was the inheritance that actually mattered. Not titles, not estates, not even the kingdom. The wisdom to know when holding on caused more death than letting go. And the courage to open your hands anyway. The Portuguese coast appeared through morning haze like a promise nobody had dared to make. White buildings climbing hillsides, fishing boats dotting a harbor that had never heard of Vesper Isle. A village so small it didn't appear on most maps, which made it perfect for people who needed to stop existing. Adrian stood at the bow of the final evacuation boat, watching the shoreline grow closer. His side still ached where Harrow's bullet had torn through him months ago. The scar tissue pulled with every breath, a constant reminder of the lighthouse, of the choice he'd made, of the man he'd become in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Beside him, Seraphine was silent. She'd been quiet for days now, ever since they'd locked the caves behind them and sailed away from the ruins. Adrian understood. There was a difference between surviving something and processing what survival had cost. The gap between those two states could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. The boat nudged against the stone dock. Portuguese fishermen barely glanced at them. Just another group of refugees from wars nobody bothered to name anymore. Europe was full of displaced people. A few dozen more made no difference to anyone who wasn't counting. Adrian stepped onto solid ground and felt something shift. Not relief, not safety, just the absence of constant motion, of running, of collapsing kingdoms and burning harbors and choices made in 3-second windows that destroyed 3 centuries. Ren appeared beside him, weathered face creased with something approaching satisfaction. Made it. Against all odds and basic common sense, we actually made it. Adrian looked back at the boat, at the 30 people disembarking with everything they owned carried in packs and bundles. We made it, he agreed. But we didn't win. Ren's expression was understanding. Winning was never an option, son. Just different degrees of losing. He clapped Adrian's shoulder. Your father would have been proud. You chose the loss that let people live. Adrian wasn't sure about that. His father had spent 3 decades avoiding this exact outcome, scattering Vesper's people into diaspora, destroying the kingdom to save its refugees. Cedric had believed in preservation through secrecy. Adrian had learned that some things couldn't be preserved, only released, like holding water in your hands. You could grip tighter and watch it drain through your fingers, or you could open your palms and let it flow where it needed to go. The village elder appeared, a stooped man named João, who'd been paid well in advance to ask no questions. He led them up winding streets to a cluster of abandoned houses on the village's northern edge, old fishermen's cottages that had sat empty since storms had claimed their owners years ago. These are yours, João said in Portuguese accented English. Supplies inside, food, water, fishing nets if you need work. He looked at Adrian. You want to disappear? This is the place. Nobody comes here. Nobody asks questions. You keep to yourselves, you'll be safe. Adrian nodded. Thank you. João studied him with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. You're running from something big. I can tell. Just make sure it doesn't follow you here. This village has peace. I'd like to keep it. It won't follow, Seraphine said quietly. There's nothing left to follow. João nodded slowly. Then welcome. Try to find some peace of your own. He left them standing in the dusty street surrounded by empty houses and new lives they'd have to invent from silence and scar tissue. The first weeks were mechanical, unpacking, organizing, learning the village rhythms, when boats went out, when markets opened, how to blend into a community that wanted nothing more than to be left alone. The Vesper refugees scattered among the cottages, keeping to small groups, speaking quietly. They were learning the same lesson Adrian was learning, how to be nobody. It was harder than he'd expected. Not the physical work, repairing roofs, mending nets, hauling catch from boats when the fishermen needed extra hands. That was simple, exhausting but straightforward. The hard part was the silence inside his own head. Without kingdoms to save or invasions to prevent or treaties to negotiate, there was just Adrian and the weight of everything he'd done. 300 dead, an island destroyed, a father's legacy erased. Those facts sat in his chest like stones, and no amount of physical labor made them lighter. He found himself standing on the cliffs north of the village at dawn, staring at the Atlantic and thinking about the lighthouse, about Harrow's face when the tower had started to collapse, about the sound of stone grinding against stone as an entire kingdom tore itself apart. Some mornings, he wondered if he should have made different choices, tried negotiation harder, trusted Malcolm less, found a way to save Vesper without destroying it. Other mornings, he knew with bone-deep certainty that there had never been another option. The moment his father had died, Vesper's fate was sealed. Adrian had just been the executor of an ending Cedric had written years ago. That knowledge didn't make the weight lighter. It just made it more bearable. There was a difference. Seraphine found him on the cliffs one morning 3 weeks after their arrival. She'd been avoiding him, throwing herself into organizing the refugees, making sure families had what they needed, keeping busy enough that thinking became optional. But now she stood beside him, staring at the same ocean with the same haunted expression. "I keep seeing them," she said quietly, "the ones we lost. I close my eyes and I'm back in the fortress, watching it come down, hearing them scream." Adrian didn't answer immediately. What was there to say? That time would make it easier? That was a lie. Time just made you better at carrying weight that never actually decreased. Instead, he said, "I see Harrow every time I sleep, falling, and I feel nothing. No guilt, no regret. Just calculation. Like watching a problem solve itself." Seraphine looked at him. "That scares you. It should scare everyone." Adrian's voice was rough. "I watched a man die and felt nothing but relief that he wouldn't be able to hurt my people anymore." "What does that make me?" "Human," Seraphine said simply. "You think I haven't made the same calculations? I commanded Vesper's defenses for 8 years. Every decision was measured in potential casualties. Every strategy was about acceptable losses." She paused. "The difference between us and monsters isn't whether we make those calculations. It's whether we remember the people behind the numbers. Do you remember? Every single one." Her voice cracked. "And I hate that I had to learn their names." They stood in silence while waves crashed below, and somewhere in the village behind them, 3,000 scattered survivors tried to figure out how to be whole again. Finally, Adrian spoke. "My father spent 30 years keeping Vesper secret, maintaining the illusion of safety. And when I inherited that responsibility, the first thing I did was destroy it." He looked at Seraphine. "Was I wrong?" She met his eyes. "You were desperate. And desperate people don't get to make good choices. Just necessary ones. What if the necessary choice is the wrong one? Then you live with it." Seraphine's expression was steel-wrapped in exhaustion. "You carry the weight, you help the survivors build something new, and you hope that 50 years from now, when we're all dead and gone, someone remembers that Vesper existed, that 3,000 people survived, that it mattered." Adrian wanted to believe that, wanted to think that meaning could be extracted from ruins and graveyards. But standing on the cliffs with Portuguese wind cutting through him, all he felt was hollow. Maybe that was growth. Learning that not every question had an answer, that some weights never got lighter, that survival sometimes looked exactly like defeat, and you lived with the ambiguity until you couldn't anymore. 2 months after arriving in Portugal, Adrian received a letter. It came through networks Ren had maintained, old naval contacts who moved messages for people who needed to stay invisible. The envelope was sealed with black wax. No return address, just his name written in elegant script. Inside, a single page. He recognized the handwriting immediately. His father's. Adrian's hand shook as he read, "If you're reading this, I'm dead. And if you found Vesper, you've learned things about me I never wanted you to know. I wasn't a good father. I knew that then. I know it now. But I want you to understand why. When I was 23, I discovered Vesper by accident. Found people who'd survived by being invisible for 200 years. They needed protection I could provide, leadership I could fake. So I gave them 30 years of my life. But I never gave them you. You were the one thing I kept separate. The one part of my life that wasn't measured in survival calculations and acceptable losses. And I kept you away because I knew that if you ever learned about Vesper, you'd try to save it. You'd sacrifice yourself for people you'd never met. Because that's who you are, who you've always been. I couldn't let you become what I became. Someone who looked at human beings and saw numbers, resources, variables and equations that never balanced. So I pushed you away, made you hate me. Thought that distance would protect you. I was wrong. And I'm sorry. By the time you read this, Vesper will have fallen. You'll have made impossible choices. You'll carry weight I never wanted you to lift. And you'll wonder if you did the right thing. Let me answer that. There was no right thing, just less wrong options. And whatever you chose, know that it was better than what I would have done. Because you still have something I lost decades ago. The ability to feel the weight. I stopped feeling it somewhere around year 15. Stopped seeing individuals, started seeing populations. That's when I stopped being a man and started being a function. A machine that processed survival calculations. Don't let that happen to you. Feel the weight. Carry it. Let it hurt. Because the moment it stops hurting is the moment you become what I became. A ghost ruling a kingdom that shouldn't exist, protecting people by keeping them caged. You're better than I was. You were always better than I was. Be better than I could ever be. And forgive yourself for the things you had to do. I never managed it. Maybe you can. Your father, who loved you more than he loved his own survival. Adrian read the letter 3 times. Then he sat on the cottage floor and cried for the first time since his father's funeral. Not quiet tears. Ugly, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken and finally, mercifully, allowed to crack open. Seraphine found him like that. She didn't ask questions. Just sat beside him, one hand on his shoulder, present in a way that didn't demand explanation. When Adrian could finally speak, his voice was wrecked. He knew. My father knew Vesper would fall. He prepared for it. And he spent 30 years trying to keep me away from the ending he knew was coming. Seraphine read the letter. Her expression shifted. Anger, understanding, grief, all cycling through in seconds. He loved you, she said finally. In the most twisted, self-destructive way possible. But he loved you. Adrian looked at his father's handwriting, at the apology that came too late, and the permission he'd never thought he needed. I destroyed his life's work. No! Seraphine's voice was firm. You completed it. He built Vesper's defenses. You executed its evacuation. He kept them hidden. You set them free. She paused. You're not his opposite, Adrian. You're his conclusion. Adrian folded the letter carefully, placed it in the wooden box where he kept the iron key and the map that had started everything. Artifacts from a kingdom that didn't exist anymore. But the people did. 3,000 conclusions to his father's 30-year premise, scattered across Europe and beyond. Living lives Cedric had made possible by building escape routes nobody hoped to use. That was the inheritance that mattered, not the title, not the estate. The preparation for endings nobody wanted to face, and the son who'd been brave enough or broken enough to face them anyway. Damn. 6 months after arriving in Portugal, something unexpected happened. Adrian started building. Not kingdoms, not empires, just a small boat. He worked on it in the mornings before the fishing fleet departed, measuring planks, shaping wood, learning from Portuguese craftsmen who taught him through gestures and broken English how to make something that could survive the Atlantic's moods. Seraphine watched him work one morning, expression curious. What's this for? Adrian sanded a plank smooth, not looking up. I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything, he paused. I just needed to make something instead of destroying things. She picked up a tool, started helping without asking permission. They worked in silence, comfortable silence, the kind that came from surviving impossible things together. By the end of the month, other Vesper refugees had joined them. Thomas Kerr brought engineering expertise. Victoria contributed organizational precision. Even Lord Marcus, who'd been planning to sail to America, postponed his departure to help. The boat became a project, a focus, something the scattered survivors could build together that wasn't about running or hiding or mourning what they'd lost. It took 4 months to complete. A 30-foot sailing vessel with clean lines and a sturdy hull. Built from Portuguese pine and Vesper survivors' determination to make something beautiful from their collective grief. They launched it on a gray afternoon with half the village watching. The boat slid into the water without ceremony, floated, held. Adrian stood on the dock, watching his creation bob in the harbor, and felt something he hadn't felt since before his father's funeral. Pride. Not the hollow pride of titles or inherited estates. Real pride. The kind that came from making something with your hands and seeing it work. Seraphine appeared beside him. What are you going to call it? Adrian thought about Vesper Isle, about kingdoms that existed in secret, about fathers who loved their sons by pushing them away, about 300 graves and 3,000 new beginnings. He thought about the lighthouse, about falling, about choosing to jump into open air and trusting that something would catch you. Resolution, he said. Seraphine's smile was soft, perfect. Seek. 1 year after Vesper's fall, Adrian received another visitor. This time, it was Lord Marcus Thorne. The older man looked different, tanned from Portuguese sun, leaner from physical labor, something lighter in his eyes than the bitter anger that had defined him on the island. He found Adrian on the cliffs where Adrian spent most mornings now, watching the Atlantic and thinking about nothing in particular. Marcus stood beside him without speaking for a long while. Then, I'm leaving for America next week. Wanted to say goodbye. Adrian nodded. You'll do well there. Maybe. Marcus's voice was rough with something approaching hope. Here they need engineers, people who know how to build things in places that don't exist on maps yet. Figure that's a skill set I've got practice with. Adrian smiled slightly. You'll rebuild. Maybe better than before. Maybe. Marcus looked at him. What about you? You staying here? I think so. Adrian gestured to the village below. These people need something. Leadership's the wrong word. But someone who remembers. Someone who makes sure Vesper doesn't just disappear into silence. Marcus nodded slowly. Your father would have hated that. He spent 30 years making sure nobody remembered. I'm not my father. No. Marcus's expression softened. You're better. He extended his hand. Take care of them, Duke. Adrian shook his hand. I'm not a Duke anymore. Just Adrian. You'll always be the Duke to us. Marcus's grip was firm. The man who destroyed a kingdom to save its people. That's worth more than any title England could give you. He left before Adrian could respond. Walked back down to the village where a boat waited to carry him to Lisbon, then across the ocean to a continent that didn't care about fallen kingdoms or inherited guilt. Adrian watched him go and felt the weight shift slightly. Not lighter, just distributed differently. Shared among 3,000 people who carried pieces of Vesper with them into whatever futures they built. That was his father's real legacy. Not the island, the people, and the network of survivors who'd rebuild in 1,000 small ways across a dozen countries. Cedric had planted seeds for forests he'd never see, and Adrian had watered them with blood and ruins and choices that still woke him at 3 a.m. in cold sweats. But the seeds were growing, and maybe that was enough. 2 years after Vesper's fall, Adrian stood in the village square as Portuguese children played around him. They didn't know what he'd been, didn't care. To them, he was just the quiet Englishman who built boats and sometimes told stories about islands in the fog. Seraphine found him there, watching the children with an expression somewhere between melancholy and peace. She'd become the village's unofficial organizer, mediating disputes, coordinating work, keeping the refugee community functional. Leadership by a different name. Walk with me? She asked. They climbed to their usual spot on the cliffs. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before them, hiding Vesper's ruins somewhere beyond the horizon. I got a message from Wren, Seraphine said. He's in Denmark, helping another group of refugees get settled. Says they're doing well. Good. Thomas is in America with Marcus. They're building something. Not sure what yet. Victoria's in France, working as a translator. She paused. Everyone's scattering, finding new lives, forgetting. Adrian looked at her. Is that what you want? To forget? No. Seraphine's voice was quiet. I want to remember, but I want it to stop hurting so much. I don't think it works that way. I know. She turned to face him. But I want to try anyway. With you, if you'll have me. Adrian's breath caught. This wasn't about survival anymore. Wasn't about shared trauma or desperate alliances. This was about two people who'd walked through fire together and decided they wanted to keep walking. Toward something instead of away from everything. I'm not easy to live with, he said. I wake up most nights. See things that aren't there. Carry weight that doesn't go away. So do I. Seraphine's smile was sad and honest. We're both wrecked, Adrian. But maybe we can be wrecked together. Build something new from what's left. Adrian thought about his father's letter, about forgiveness and weight and the difference between surviving and living. He thought about kingdoms destroyed and people saved and choices that couldn't be undone. He thought about the boat he'd built. Resolution. Moving forward because backward wasn't an option. Yes, he said. I'd like that. They stood on the cliffs as the sun set over the Atlantic. Two survivors of a kingdom nobody would remember. Two people who'd learned the hardest lesson power could teach. That true strength wasn't about control. It was about knowing when to let go. When to open your hands and watch everything you'd fought for scatter into the wind, and then building something new from what remained. 5 years after Vesper's fall, Adrian received one final letter from England. Gerald, the old steward, had died. The Blackthorn estate was being sold to cover debts Cedric had left unpaid. Did Adrian want to claim anything before the auction? Adrian read the letter twice. Then he wrote back a single line. Let it go. There's nothing there I need. He sent the letter and felt something release. The last tie to who he'd been. The last connection to the man his father had tried to protect him from becoming. The estate would be sold. Some other noble would claim the halls where Adrian had grown up feeling unwanted. The Blackthorn name would fade into historical footnotes about minor dukes who'd accomplished nothing remarkable. And that was fine, because the real legacy, the one that mattered, wasn't in England. It was scattered across a dozen countries. Thomas building infrastructure in America, Victoria translating for refugees in France, Marcus designing water systems in places that didn't appear on maps, hundreds of others living quiet lives, raising children, building communities. 3,000 seeds from one destroyed kingdom, growing into forests Cedric had never imagined. That was worth more than estates or titles or names carved into stone. That was what survival looked like when you stopped measuring it in territory and started measuring it in lives lived fully. Adrian stood in the doorway of the cottage he shared with Seraphine, watching Portuguese sunset paint the village gold. Inside, dinner was cooking. Seraphine was humming something, an old Vesper song barely anyone remembered anymore. Outside, children played in streets that had never heard of hidden kingdoms or desperate evacuations. This was the resolution his father had prepared for, but never believed would come. Not just survival, but peace. The kind of peace that came after fire. Scarred. Changed. But real. Adrian walked inside, closed the door on the past, and sat down to dinner with the woman who'd helped him destroy a kingdom and build a life from its ashes. And for the first time since standing over his father's coffin, he felt something approaching contentment. Not happiness. Happiness was too simple a word for what they'd been through. But contentment. The bone-deep understanding that he'd done what needed doing, that the weight he carried was worth carrying, that 300 deaths had purchased 3,000 futures, that sometimes love looked like destruction, and protection looked like letting go, and strength looked like admitting you couldn't save everything, so you saved what you could. His father had taught him that, not through words or warmth or any of the ways Adrian had wanted to be taught, but through absence and silence and a 30-year object lesson in the cost of power. And Adrian had learned, had become someone who could make impossible choices and carry their weight without collapsing. Had become, finally, the man Cedric had always hoped he'd be. Not a duke, not a ruler, Just a man who'd faced the worst endings possible and chosen to survive them with his humanity intact. That was the inheritance that actually mattered. Not kingdoms or titles or legacies carved in stone. The ability to lose everything and still find reasons to build something new. Adrian raised his glass in silent toast to his father's ghost, to Vesper Isle, to 300 graves and 3,000 survivors, to kingdoms that existed and kingdoms that fell and kingdoms that lived on in the scattered hearts of people who remembered. And then he drank and ate dinner and laughed at something Seraphine said and lived another ordinary day in a life purchased through extraordinary sacrifice. Because that was what resolution looked like. Not triumph, not tragedy, just the quiet continuation of existence. The radical act of choosing to keep going after everything fell apart. The kingdom was gone. The people remained. And Adrian Vale, former duke, destroyer of legacies, builder of small boats and smaller hopes, had finally learned what his father spent 30 years trying to teach him. That survival wasn't about power. It was about knowing when to let power go. And that love, real love, sometimes meant pushing away the people you cared about most, because protecting them meant protecting them from you, from the choices you'd have to make, from the weight you'd have to carry. His father had carried that weight alone for 3 decades, had died still carrying it, had left Adrian a letter and a kingdom and instructions for how to survive its destruction. And Adrian had followed those instructions, had made the choices Cedric couldn't make, had opened his hands and let Vesper scatter into the wind so its people could finally be free. That was the gift, the real inheritance, not the burden of power, but the permission to release it. Adrian stood and walked to the window, looked out at the village where former refugees lived as fishermen and craftsmen and farmers, where children who'd been born on Vesper were growing up Portuguese, where the past was slowly, finally, releasing its grip on the future. And he smiled. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. The weight was still there. The grief still surfaced. The choices still haunted him in the hours before dawn. But he'd survived them. They all had. And that survival meant something. It meant Vesper had never been about the island. It had been about the people. And as long as those people lived and built and remembered, the kingdom existed. Not as territory on a map, but as a network of survivors who carried its spirit forward into whatever futures they created. That was worth destroying an island for. That was worth carrying the weight forever. And standing in a Portuguese cottage 5 years after the fall, watching sunset paint the Atlantic the same colors that used to light Vesper's cliffs, Adrian Vale finally understood what his father had known all along. Some kingdoms were meant to fall, so their people could finally rise. And the greatest act of leadership wasn't building something that lasted forever. It was building something strong enough to be torn down when the time came. Strong enough to scatter into seeds, to grow into forest, to become something bigger than stone and territory could ever contain. His father had built that, and Adrian had released it. And now they both rested, one in the ground, one in the quiet peace of knowing he'd done what needed doing. The Duke's ghost was finally laid to rest. The kingdom was gone. The people survived. And that, more than power, more than legacy, more than every title England could bestow, was enough.